All right, just a brief introduction of PTAC. Most of you have heard this before. So the only additional announcement I really want to make is we are going live with our new name, our new branding on September 15th. We'll have our new website, format, our new logos, everything goes on display on, goes live September 15th. And then on October 12th, it's National Apex Accelerator Day. That's our new program name, Apex Accelerators. And there's going to be different programs, different events, different webinars that will be made available across the US from all the different programs, as well as our association on October 12th. So keep an eye out for that. More information to be found. Learn more about our new funders and our new program and see our new look. So we'll have our kind of official open house in October, but we do go live September. And the last takeaway, of course, is if you are extending locations, if you're working within Alaska, then absolutely the Alaska PTAC, or as we're soon to be called, Alaska Apex Accelerator, we're here to provide that free assistance with all aspects of government contracting. But if your location is outside of Alaska, or you're thinking about expanding your business into a different geographic location, check out the two other websites, the aptac-us.org or the Department of Defense Office of Small Business Programs website, which is this Apex Accelerators-US. That's the bottom link. Both of those two have a mapping function right on the landing page, and you can click on that state icon and you can get the contact information, website information for all of the various PTACs across the US, Puerto Rico, Guam, and now Marianas Islands. So a lot of great information and a lot of great resources, especially if you're thinking of diversifying your business from, just more than conducting business within the state of Alaska boundary. So here's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to see this word debrief a lot. So what is it? Why are we here? Why are we talking about it? We're going to talk about the process flow. We're going to talk about debrief triggers, both the pre-award and award notifications, timeliness and scheduling, when are they required? And this is required for the contracting officers to perform. We're going to talk about content. What can the agencies discuss and not discuss? And then, of course, we're going to discuss strategies. And last but not least, we're going to have a brief conversation on that. We're doing a debrief because we intend to protest, or should we protest? And we'll save that for towards the end of the webinar today. A lot of good information. All right, so what is this? What is a debrief? So in its most basic form, it's simply a way for a contractor to learn from the agency what they did well, what they didn't do well, and it's applicable for both you won the award or this time you weren't the apparent awardee. I hate that phrase, you lost, but in essence, ultimately, there is going to be those that have received the award and don't. And oftentimes, if you're the awardee, you don't think to request for the debrief, and you miss out on that opportunity to find out why they chose you. So for the government, the debrief process allows them to conduct business with integrity and fairness. It demonstrates its openness to the public, it helps improve that public trust, and it helps promote competition. Now, for some agencies, debriefs are a little bit frightening, that people are only doing debriefs because they're waiting for that hesitation, that aha moment, that gray area in which the contractor is then going to pounce on them and the protests start flying. So there's a hesitancy on some of the contracting agencies. Some agencies are more debrief shy than others, and they want to keep that in arm's length. But what we need to do, and that's really kind of the focus of the entirety of today's presentation, is to think about it as a positive aspect of a conversation between the agency and the offeror of where can we improve so that our future competitions are much more competitive, are stronger. We're using the languages that you want to see that we're communicating in a better format. And that's all part of that conducting business with integrity and fairness. Because we've all had those concepts of uh, based on our own experience where we might say, let's just use this as kind of a very simplified example, but if I say I saw a bird today and I want you to, give me a picture of a bird, but my experience of what birds I might have seen looking out my window in my backyard, hey, look, the magpies are out, might be different than you. Say you're down in Seattle and those eagles are back. So there's that perception, that difference of we did provide what you wanted. We don't understand why our package didn't do better, why we didn't get the award. So this is that opportunity post-activity to really help clarify where were the perception errors, where were the communication errors, what was missing from your debrief. So it's a critical communication element. And if we keep thinking of it as that opportunity to promote future activity, then it removes some of that fear of conflict from the activity itself. And of course, there is a component of that of did the agency do what they said they would? And we'll talk more about that in a moment. So again, from the government, it's again, openness to the public. For the contractor, it's kind of all these things I've already discussed. Better understanding of proposal weaknesses and or strengths. And we forget about that part. Well, what did they really like about our proposal? We don't want to go in with a defeatist attitude of, okay, where did I mess up? We want to know, well, what did you like? What resonated with you? And then that gives us that opportunity for that, well, the awardee. And we'll talk about more what can the contracting officer discuss or not discuss. What factors or deficiencies led to the exclusion from the award? So maybe our price point was really strong, but the technical was lacking, or our technical was fantastic and everyone was excited about it, but the price point then threw us out. And there wasn't enough discussion in the technical to substantiate the price point. So it depends again, what are those evaluation factors and how is the agency determining that award? And what we want to do is we want to have that comparison from where were those evaluation factors, how are they prioritized, how are they listed, how are they weighted, and then how was our offering rated, marked up compared to those evaluation factors. Okay, so what components led to the award? Again, we're talking about both those strengths and weaknesses. And this almost needs to be a flag on each page because the ultimate goal is to build stronger future proposal and to build better agency relationships. The more we get to have these conversations with them, hopefully not always, maybe sometimes as the awardee and on the other side of that coin as well, but we want to, again, better that relationship, better understand what is it the agency is looking at, because better we understand what that owner is looking for, the stronger our proposals are going to be. So let's talk about the debrief processing flow. So we have kind of a 2-point. We have pre-award and award determination made. So if we have a more complex solicitation, and there might be language within the solicitation package that the agency has discussions on how they're going to handle the competitive range, that they might or retain the right to have discussions. They may award without discussions, but all of that is referring to the potential of winnowing the competitive range. So if we have 20 competitors, 20 proposals received, the agency may decide to look at the top 3 and then enter discussions with those top 3 and let the other 17 know that they have been then excluded from competitive range. And at that point, it's exactly as it sounds. They're not moving forward with an opportunity to further provide any further information or an adjusted proposal. So they've been removed from the competitive range. So at that point in time, then of course there's the notification to the contractors from the contracting officer that they've been removed from the competitive range. And the contractor, the offeror, then has an opportunity to decide, do they want to request a pre-award debriefing now, or do they want to wait for the award notification? And I'm not going to go into as much detail with the pre-award debriefing. The articles that I've attached for your information kind of talk about that in a little bit more detail, but there's less information that they can give you at that time simply because, well, they don't have an apparent awardee yet. There's more decision to be made that can help you compete. So you get one or the other. So if you do request a pre-award debriefing, you can't request a second debriefing after the final award is made. So depending on the solicitation, depending on where you are at, and will it be beneficial for you to gather some information now, maybe you have more proposals that you're working on for this particular agency, and some feedback now would be really beneficial. So there's a timeliness factor into that. How's it going to benefit you? Do you want this now, or do you want to wait? So if you say yes, then you have to submit that written debrief request to the contracting officer. And of course, the contracting officer then schedules that debrief time. So we can see the color difference. The blue is just kind of, this is the contracting officer. This orange is then that response falls to the offeror, the contractor, and then back to the contracting officer to then put that schedule in place. When we have an award determination that has been made, again, the contracting officer has to notify all of the offerors, the status. And once that has been done, then the clock begins to tick, and you have a time period in which you have to request your debrief. And we'll go over that with the timing and that in a couple of slides. And again, it's a yes, no point. If you decide, nope, this time we're not going to do it for whatever particular reason, no further actions needed. But if yes, again, you have to get that written request to the contracting officer, and it does have to be a written request. You can't pick up a phone call and say, hey, I want to do a debrief. It needs to be a written request. And then, of course, that debrief is scheduled. And there's timelines that are recommended, but are not necessarily absolute as to when that debrief is going to be held. All right. Give me just 1 second here. All right, so what is the debrief trigger? So when we look back at our schedule, it's right here. This first two boxes. So when is this triggered? So the trigger within the FAR reference that initiates a debrief or debriefing like action is when a decision is made by the contracting officer. So the contracting officer renders a decision, and again, it's either that exclusion from competitive range or the award announcement of a pending award, parent awardee. Sometimes the language just changes, or simply there is an award announcement. So this is the starting point for all debriefing initiatives. So we kind of talked about the pre-award a little bit, but I do want to give you the language. So when is the pre-award kick in? The contracting officer shall notify promptly in writing when the proposals are excluded from the competitive range or otherwise eliminated from competition. The notification to unsuccessful offers, so here's our timing. So within 3 days after the date of contract award, the contracting officer shall provide written notification to each offer whose proposal was in the competitive range but not selected for award. So they are kind of this post-award notification. Now, again, keep in mind that there's usually some generic language where the agency can make an award determination without negotiation or without discussion. And that terminology just means they decided not to, that they didn't need to have further another dive into this discussion pool. And so there was no competitive range. At that point in time, if you just skip that, you go right to post-award, then apparently they were able to move forward with their justification for award. And so here's our timeline. Within 3 days of the date of the contract award, and this is that notification. The notice shall include the number of officers solicited, the number of proposals received, the name and address of each offeror receiving an award, and of course, items, quantities, stated unit price of each award. So at a minimum in the award notice, we're going to get the awardee, the apparent awardee, the company name, usually their UEI number, and the award amount. And you'll see the contract award number itself. So we get the 3 points. The awardee name, sometimes you'll get their UEI number, so you can look them up in SAM or look up more information on the awardee, the contract number, and the award amount. So back to notification to the unsuccessful. So in general terms, the reasons that offeror, this is the continuation of the clause 15503, and this is the continuation of information that can be provided. General terms, the reason the offeror's proposal was not accepted unless the price information paragraph reveals the reason. So if it's a low price, technically acceptable, or technically acceptable low price, then, and those are the only determination, then often it was either technically not acceptable or you simply weren't low price. So it depends again on how those evaluation terms are stated in the solicitation as to what your notification might be looked at in the term of why or why not was it accepted. Upon request, the contracting officer shall furnish the information described in paragraph B1 of this section to unsuccessful offers in solicitation using simplified acquisition procedures in part 13. So depending on how the solicitation was handled, it really is part of that. What are you entitled to as a debrief? So let's talk about when is it required. So our debriefs required for every procurement activity, and not necessarily. It depends on how that was done. So when an offer may receive a post-award debrief and to what extent depends on the FAR proceedings being utilized for the procurement. So this is when we get to learn all more about those FAR parts. So FAR part 15 is contracting by negotiation, and this really is the bulk of the procurement activity. And often what you'll see in those evaluation factors is these negotiated procurements are going to have some sort of best value trade-off evaluation factor that the agency is going to then use along with those discussions of how the proposals are going to be weighted, evaluated, scored, to then allow the agency to make a justification for award. So FAR Part 15 is just that, contracting by negotiated. You have the FAR 16.5, which Part 16 was all for the indefinite delivery contracts. And here, under 16.5, we have a threshold. So when we talk about task orders, whether it's against a GSA multiple award schedule or an existing IDIQ contract, like we might see the military sabers or the JOCs, the job order contracts, that the task orders themselves aren't necessarily open for a debrief discussion. One, it has to be competitive, and two, it has to exceed that $6 million threshold. So if we have the case of an IDIQ has been awarded, but there are multiple competitors, multiple awards with that overall arcing IDIQ contract, that indefinite delivery, indefinitely quantity contract, and we hit this dollar threshold, then there is that opportunity to request a debrief for that particular task order or delivery order activity. If it's under that dollar threshold, then no, there's not necessarily that guarantee that you get to request a debrief. Under FAR Part 14, we have this sealed bidding, and they consider there's a two-step process. So under two-step sealed bidding, then under the step 2, yes, there is information that can be provided under a debriefing. But keep in mind what makes that FAR Part 14 sealed bidding is it is a low price. There is not a trade-off factor. There's not an evaluation factor. It's simply low price. And then there are some qualifiers for, was the contractor, do they have the capacity to do it? Are they responsive? And is it reasonable? So there's some predetermination of the contractor's ability to be able to perform that work as part of that contractor responsibility review, but ultimately the evaluation factor in a sealed bid is price. So, and then we have FAR Part 12, the acquisition of commercial items, and this one can be a little bit tricky. So the commercial items, you know, that basic off the shelf, whether it's supply or service, and under these acquisition of commercial items, it says here, offers are not entitled to a debriefing. Rather, they are only entitled to a brief explanation of award and only if requested. So it's more up to the agency. So again, there should be some sort of brief explanation of why the award, but not necessarily a sit-down longer discussion that you expect under a debrief, under a negotiated process. The one catch with the commercial acquisition items, if they are used in conjunction with the policies and procedures for solicitation, evaluation, award prescribed in Part 15, contracting by negotiation. So even though if the solicitation says this is a commercial activity procured under FAR Part 12, but they have evaluation language and they start discussing negotiation, or maybe there's a component of that commercial that would be negotiated, because there can be a much more complex combined solicitation packages, but then they might open that up if they're using evaluation and award processes described by Part 15, that contracting by negotiation, then that does open the agency up for that requirement to provide a debrief. Again, the catch-all is only if requested. So keep that in mind. All right, the federal supply schedule, we have the FAR 8.4052. Again, if an unsuccessful offer requests information, a brief explanation shall be provided. So this might be in the case of where the whole activity is only found in that eBuy, the GSA Advantage platform, where it wasn't even posted as a competitive aspect, but it was all behind the scenes, and it was competition based on between schedule holders. So if that is the scenario, then yes, here is the language in the clause that allows you to request that brief explanation. The simplified acquisition procedures, so that's the purchasing threshold that is tied to, the threshold is, I believe, now 300,000. It was increased as of last year, but if it's under that dollar threshold, under that simplified acquisition procedure, there's a more, again, simplified process, but there's also that presumption that that activity then has been set aside for small business. It's not necessarily been a full and open competition. So under the simplified acquisition, that do not exceed that simplified acquisition threshold for which automatic notification is not provided through electronic commerce methods. So again, looking at the type of solicitation activity and which of these FAR Part overall guidance is used to define that solicitation activity. Not all, the bottom line is not all solicitations or not all proposals have that opportunity where you can request a full debrief. Instead, you're getting a brief explanation. So with this in mind, and I'm not going to dig into this, it's a lot of text. I'll let you save that for later. But the takeaway from today's discussion is we want to take a look at when we're in that solicitation phase and take a look at what FAR part is being used as the guidance for the contracting officer to determine, well, how is the award being made? What requirements are in place? Are we doing this as a sealed bidding? Is it a negotiated? Is it a commercial activity where we know at most we can request a brief explanation? And then again, if we see that negotiated activity, then we know that we are entitled to that full debrief. And keep in mind, each one of these FAR parts actually do have clauses associated that talk about that request for information post-award. So let's move on to the next section, initiating the request. So debriefs are not triggered by the contracting officer. They're not going to say, okay, here's the awardee, and oh, by the way, do you want a debrief? That is something that has to be initiated by the offeror. And you need to follow the written instructions provided in the notification. You need to submit a written request back to the contractor within the time standard provided in the notification. So there is some variation depending upon whether you're entitled for a full debrief or that explanation of decision. So pre-award briefing, you have to submit within 3 days after receiving notice of exclusion. So again, this is under that FAR Part 15, under that negotiated process. And of course, post-award debriefing, well, it's simple. You've got 3 days. So the easiest way to remember this is 3 days is your deadline. You received your notification of awardee or notification that you were not the awardee. You have that three-day timeline from the date of that notification to then turn around and request debrief. If you're past the 3 days, you can still request the debrief. However, the contracting officer is not required to provide a debrief because you've missed that window of opportunity. So when you're talking about that solicitation timeline and you're thinking bid dates, when is the contracting officer going to then announce an award? What's that evaluation time going to look like? But you need to be aware of and make sure that there's somebody available to be able to request, hey, we want that debrief. You have that 3-day window. And of course, here's the FAR clause that kind of talks about what the timeline within that. So for a written request, and of course, this can be done electronically, you can do this through an email process, but there has to be that written request. So as per notification, and this is just an example, company A, we would like to request a debrief on solicitation, and you want the number and title. You need to let the contracting officer know which. Our end goal is to strengthen future submittals by receiving your evaluation notes and comments on any proposal deficiencies, as well as our proposal strength. If possible, we would like to meet with you in person or virtually or telephonically, however that works for you, your company, and where that, the distance between you and that contracting officer. But the whole idea of my little written comment here is we want it to be a request and we want it to be a positive request. We don't want to trigger any fear from the contracting officer that they are immediately moving into a potentially hostile activity, because we want to have that conversation. And it seems straightforward, but I don't know how many of you have been really frustrated and you write that angry email and you send it off and it's like, oh, wait. It's really funny because I always have somebody, when I'm writing my angry emails, I always get someone else to read it to make sure, am I being reasonable? How is this being received? And it's really funny. But we want to have this as a positive opportunity. We don't want to shy away those contracting officers because we want to have a discussion. And a lot of agencies have have guidance that keeps the offeror at arm's length, where you are given a written synopsis and that is your debrief. And so again, we don't want our request, we want our request to be friendly, we want it to be positive, and we want to be able to initiate a conversation. So that is the purpose of this slide, is we want to have that positive language to not be pushed at arm's length and have the agency respond with our absolute minimal response requirement, which could just be a written response, and that's as good as it gets. So timeliness and scheduling. So this is when, okay, received it by the agency within 3 days after the date, the offers received notification, and then to the maximum extent practical, the debriefing should occur within 5 days after receipt of the written request. Now keep in mind, this is the FAR guidance 15506. Part 15 is all under that negotiated procurement. And to maximum extent practical. So again, this is another reason where our request wants to be positive, wants to, if we have a timeliness component in it, we want to encourage sooner rather than later, let them know that there are other solicitation activities for the same agency that you are in process of developing. So you really need to get that conversation initiated so that you can better improve for these next contracting activity. Let the contracting officer know there's benefit for both parties if they can do that sooner than rather than later. Because that extent practicable is, when is the contracting officer's calendar even going to be free? So keep that in mind. So if we are looking at now September, and we're coming into that last final hurrah for the end of the fiscal year, and awards now, are you going to get a debrief before October 30th? Maybe. Are you going to get a debrief by end of September? Keep in mind, even though I said that completely backwards. The end of the fiscal year is September 30th, October 1st starts the next fiscal year. So trying to get a debrief in when the contracting officers are down to the wire to get the last of those contracts executed before those ledgers close and that contracting spending year is over. No, extent to practical, it's not going to happen. The time is simply not there. Will they do that then in October when they have finished closing out the last of those contracts? Absolutely, that's when that time starts to free up. So be aware of what's going on with that contracting officer in that time, to the extent practical, but hopefully within 5 days. If you're not getting a response with the contracting officer, feel free to follow up your request and just ask. We're just verifying the receipt of our request that we submitted on such and such date. We'd like to get on your calendar for that debrief. All right, so an offeror that was notified of an exclusion from competition but failed to submit a timely request is not entitled to a debriefing. So that notified of exclusion from competition, whether that was the competitive range, or again, simply an award notice, is still that being excluded from competition. And if you missed your time, you're not entitled to a debriefing. Again, you can always request and see if the contracting officer is willing to do that after the fact, but they are no longer required to provide that under the FAR Part 15 activities. Keep in mind, based on those others, if it's a commercial activity or under the simplified threshold or those factors where it's not that negotiated realm, it's that request for explanation, that brief explanation. We want to have that opportunity to have that conversation. Okay, so here's another point that I really should have highlighted, this 4.2. So 15.506, subset 4, subparagraph 2, the government accommodation of a request for a delayed debriefing pursuant to 15.505A2 or an untimely debriefing request does not automatically extend the deadline for filing protests. So if you feel that there is that possibility that the agency did not evaluate in the method using the methodology in which they prescribed in the solicitation, and we feel that there has been a wrongful practice based on the language of that solicitation, and a protest is likely, and we're using that debriefing to clarify any misunderstandings we might have on how that evaluation was handled. Keep in mind the deadline for filing protests, because there is time limit depending on whether you are protesting to the agency or protesting to GAO. So let's talk about debriefs, and we'll come back to the discussion on protests. So just to double check, do we have any questions, anyone? I don't see any raised hands. I didn't pop out my question box. Shame on me. Okay, let me get that in place too. All right. Okay, so let's talk about the debriefing itself. We talked about when you're required, why we want to do it, when is it applicable, the timeliness of it, and let's talk about the debrief itself. So the contracting officer responds to the timely request by scheduling a debrief as soon as practical. So we kind of already talked about it, but it's worth reiterating. But how are we going to do the activity itself? So it says the contracting officer deems most appropriate, whether face-to-face, over telephone or virtual, or via a letter. And keep in mind, a lot of agencies really do have this is their debriefing methodology. But what we're hoping for is these, again, face-to-face or some sort of virtual or telephone conversation. So let's move on. All right, get this moving. So post-award debriefing by offers. So I apologize that this is such a text-heavy slide. So let's just kind of look at the highlighted section. So we already said may be done orally, in writing, or by other method acceptable to the contracting officer, not necessarily acceptable to the offeror, but acceptable to the contracting officer. The contracting officer should normally chair any debriefing session held, but not necessarily be the sole individual. They can pull in other from the source selection committee, depending on the technical component, if they feel it's beneficial. At a minimum, the debriefing information shall include, so keep in mind, at a minimum, the government's evaluation of the significant weaknesses or deficiencies in the offeror's proposal, the overall evaluated cost or price, and technical rating, and if applicable, the successful offer and the debrief offeror, the past performance information on the debriefed offer. So if past performance was a component for an evaluation factor, and if it was a very strong, heavily weighted, then there should be a response to that past performance as well. Cost, technical, past performance. Overall rankings of all offers when any ranking was developed by the agency during the source selection. So that synopsis, I'm forgetting the terminology. Apologize for that. So in sealed bidding, because there's that public opening, you can get that, and I'm just going to call it a scorecard. I know that's not the right terminology, and I'm sorry that my brain's completely dropped the word that I need, but you get to see that. There's that ranking, it's scored, there's that justification, you can see that synopsis of the bid results. In a negotiated process, that is not necessarily immediately made available to the contracting officer, where you can say, well, you were second or third, that necessarily ranking. So keep that in mind, where it's, if the ranking was developed by the source selection, and if it's applicable, a summary of the rationale for award, and for acquisitions of commercial items, the make, model, or product to be delivered to the successful offer. So if there was a mandated, it must be this product, or if the language was this product or similar, then commercial acquisition, they should let you know what is going to be delivered. So if you're looking at a product comparison, for a technical pass-fail. And number 6, then, reasonable responses to relevant questions about whether source selection procedures contained in the solicitation, applicable regulations, and other applicable authorities were followed. And number 6 is really where the protest then hangs. We need some of this information, this 1 through 5, depending whether it's that commercial, but we need the general, what were our witnesses' deficiencies in the offeror's proposal? If it was noted that in our technical proposal, a significant factor was omitted or underrepresented, well, we might have our answer right then and there. Well, yes, they did evaluate in using the methodology that they stated, kicks back to number 6, but it was in our proposal where we misunderstood, or we left something out, or we didn't give enough detail to really substantiate past performance, expertise. And again, what was it that the agency called out is that we are determining, well, these are the things that we need. So gaining this information up front, those significant weaknesses, can then help us determine, with this knowledge, now that we're in a comparative after the fact, did the agency then go ahead and did we have the information that we were missing to then make that determination based on, did the agency do what they said they were going to do in regards to determining that evaluation? And if not, then that possibility of a protest, that activity and that timeliness then kicks in. The clock starts. What the debrief does not include, of course, are trade secrets, privileged or confidential manufacturing processes, commercial financial information that is provided or confidential, including cost breakdowns, profit, indirect cost rates, and similar information, and the names of individuals providing reference information about an offeror's past performance. And an official summary of the debriefing should be included in the contract file. So that's for the contracting officer. So they are pulling that together as part of their award justification. As you're going through and being evaluated, that information is being gathered. It is there for you then to review during that debriefing process. And this part here, this including cost, breakdown, profit, and indirect rates, they're not going to give that unless it's a sealed bidding or in that 2-part sealed bidding and you get to request that debrief, and where those costs are already defined. Again, public opening of the sealed bids. In that negotiated, you get to know what the amount awarded is. And sometimes that gets a bit confusing. People are looking at that, no way they can do that under that amount, but keep in mind, you're only being awarded that first optional year within that fiscal year, unless those funds were multi-year monies, then they might be extend or under construction, depending on the phasing. But think about if you have a base year and multiple option years, that award amount is really only going to be for the base year. All right. So debrief strategies, be prepared for your debrief. Before going in, before you sit down with that contracting officer, review the evaluation criteria from the solicitation. Do you have a concern of the application of the evaluation process? And again, that's all of these number 6 right here, reasonable responses to relevant questions about whether source selection procedures contained in the solicitation applicable regulations and other applicable authorities were followed. Well, you want to kind of refresh your memory. What was the evaluation criteria? And do you feel that your solicitation aptly was pulled together, the components that were being weighted and used for evaluation purposes? How do you feel that you've done? And kind of synopsize what look at your solicitation again, kind of rate your own solicitation based on the agency criteria. How do you feel you did against that evaluation factors? So that when you remember that and you review that, then sitting down with solicitation, when the agency starts discussing their version of that, that gives you a better, more recent comparison of, oh, okay, well, maybe I didn't provide or could have been had stronger responses in these areas. Evaluate the award information against your proposed cost. So here's the process. Now we're going to look at our cost, and we're going to be looking at pretty much just that base year because that is the amount of the award that's being published. Who is the awardee? You can do a quick SWOT analysis of the firm. How do they compare against your company? If it's a direct competitor, were you anticipating them? Was it the incumbent that won the award again? These factors, where could they have been stronger than you? And if you have that in your mind for against that comparison, when your evaluation points, you can develop your questions in accordance. You can't ask agency to necessarily compare you against the awardee specifically, because then they kind of fall into that, well, what is privileged or confidential processes, techniques that were written. So if we're talking about for a technical component, how they're going about that, that can be deemed by the offeree as privileged or confidential. So, but if you've taken the time to look at the awardee and prepare, oops, sorry guys, jumped too many, that might again help you better situate for asking and pre-writing those questions that you get to ask the contracting officer. Right here, prepare a list. And what is your end goal for the debrief, and are you searching for protest fodder? Do you have a genuine concern if that was that solicitation done correctly? And if you feel that that wasn't done as published within the solicitation, have your justification, write that out ahead of time, and have questions that can help guide you to that information that you need to have in place to help you make that protest decision. So let's talk about from debrief to bid protests. The debrief can provide the basis of a protest, establish timelines for protest, and allow an unsuccessful offer bidder insight into how to improve their proposal quotation for the next procurement. It is important to note that you should always accept the first date. So again, if we have protests kicking around in the back of our mind because we have that concern going into the debrief, that, and this is from the article here, it's one that I have attached, but the individual that wrote the article says it's important to note that you should always accept the first date offered by the agency for the debriefing. While the agency may agree to delay a debriefing, the first date offered can start the clock running for the timeliness of a protest. Now, this is my only slide on protest activity. It is a topic all in its own right, and I have another source for you for learning more on protests before I discuss that. And it is important to know under which FAR part your procurement was conducted to ensure that any protest filed will be timely. So while we talked about those different FAR parts as to eligibility for that debrief, you'll want to see how are the protests to be handled for that particular, whether it's a commercial activity, simplified acquisition, or negotiated contract. And then here, 15507A, protests against award and negotiated acquisitions shall be handled in accordance with Part 33. And I dug into Part 33 quite a bit, but decided not to really dig into it for the purpose of today's webinar, but it's worth looking at. So if you're looking at just that, the protest timelines, your protest options, right here, Part 33 is your start point for that information. Use of agency protest procedures that incorporate the alternate dispute resolution provisions under executive order are encouraged for both pre-award and post-award protests. Now, PTAC, the Alaska PTAC, Alaska Apex Accelerator, got to get used to our new name. We have a subscription to Govology, and Govology is, as a subscription service, is really well known throughout our entire association. They're heavily involved in our association and provide a lot of training opportunities for association members. So the PTAX or Apex Accelerator, if they have a subscription to Govology, they get to provide a discount code for their active clients to be able to take Govology classes for free. So here, ask for the PTAC discount code. So this is one that was held, you can see March 2nd, 2023. The website is simply govology.com. Here's the link to this particular webinar. It was presented by Mark Carter in English Limited Liability Partnerships. So it was done by an attorney, and it's that effective utilization of debriefings and asserting bid protests. And this is available on demand now. If you do use that PTAC code, it reduces that $75 down, makes it a free, that you can take that activity for free. And if you have our discount code, you can take any Govology offerings for free. So it's something worth checking out if you really want more information on moving from that debrief into that protest arena. This is a fabulous training that's available to you now. So in conclusion, let's kind of wrap this up. Debriefing is a valuable tool when properly used to help an unsuccessful offer improve its bid or proposal. It's also a valuable tool for a successful offeror to really find what did they do well and what were their weak points, because your next competition might have somebody that did better in those areas in which you were weak. So still, even if you are, whether you're successful or unsuccessful offeror, valuable tool. You want that conversation. Approach the debrief as a means to improve future proposals and as a way to improve agency relationships. Remember, we want to approach it as a positive conversation against future activity and strengthen agency relationships. Provides the openness and public confidence. Again, right there, the agency is required for that purpose alone. It's a great way to solidify that relationship. As a prime, you can share debrief information with your entire proposal team, including those first tier subs. So depending on that complexity, you may or may not even have some of those first tier subs in that debrief with you. And you can always clarify with the contracting officer who all that you can bring in to that meeting. And be sure to include the debrief in your proposal practices and timelines. So when you're talking about your own best practices or operating procedures for your company, when you're looking at proposals, make sure that you are building in that calendar, that follow-up, to make sure you don't miss that window. And again, you have that 3 days in that negotiated procurement in which to get that written request for the debrief in place. If you miss that 3-day window, it's up to the agency and their availability, whether they're going to grant you that debrief or not. Phew, a lot of information. So again, let me see, do any of you all have any questions? The concept itself is pretty straightforward. Little variations depending again on which FAR part that procurement activity is being conducted under. You do have those timelines, and ultimately it is, what is your end goal? What are you hoping to get out of that debrief? And are you, one, still looking for information to improve future offerings? And two, do you have a feeling that there is something that wasn't done according to the evaluation terms and conditions outlined in the solicitation, and you are looking at that potential of a protest? So more information for you. Again, feel free to check out those Govology workshops. If you're looking for that discount code, you can email me, give me a call, let me know that you're looking for that. I'm happy to share it. You're welcome to respond to your webinar invitation if you want, just to get that code from us. Here is our contact information. Again, I'm going to do a last call for questions. Don't forget, if you're like me and you think of the perfect question after the webinar is already closed, hours later when we had a chance for our brain to clear from today's activity, feel free to still reach out to myself or anyone within the Alaska PTAC, Alaska Apex Accelerator staff and let us know how we can assist you with that contracting activity. Ask us those questions, call, leave a voice message, reach out to us. And again, you're always welcome to reply to that email, the webinar invitation. If you were unable to download those documents, let me know. I'm happy to send that out to you. And last reminder is the recording will be posted to the ptacalaska.org website, and these documentations will be linked to that on demand. You just have to scroll past the description and you'll find the links to be able to download the documents. So thank you for everyone for joining me today. I truly appreciate you taking your time to join me and to discuss debriefing activities. At this point in time, I'm going to go ahead and close the webinar.